figured it out. I don't know why I was
Got
having
it?
a hard time with that. I'm good.
Okay, I've got us back on recording, so we are recording,
Okay.
and I'll go ahead and admit, and if we need to change the privileges so you've got all the hosting and I just give it all fully over, if anything doesn't work, that's immediately what I'll do.
Okay.
Hopefully that will solve all our problems. All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Yeah. We have folks coming in.
Yes.
Welcome to everybody. Before we get started, I'm going to let Mayra and Allyson reintroduce themselves. But just a reminder to everybody, please keep your microphones on mute. And we're glad you're here.
Yeah, we're so glad that you guys are going to join us this morning. And yeah, we introduced ourselves a little bit in the keynote, so we won't spend a whole lot of time reintroducing ourselves. But yeah, again, my name is Allyson.
And I'm Mayra. And also just a quick, I know it's almost like around lunchtime, people are doing different things. So you don't have to keep your your video on also during the presentation if you don't want to. If you want to grab a snack, relax. I know we'll be here for a while, so feel free to turn those off.
Yeah, feel free. And we do have time for questions at the end. So the presentation itself will be about 35 minutes or so, maybe a couple minutes over that. And then we will have the last 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So if there were questions that did not get answered in the keynote, please feel free to just add those into the chat. Mike's going to be helping us out with navigating the chat, since when I'm sharing my screen, you can't see the chat. So we're not ignoring you. We're just going to save all the questions until the end. Also to save our sanity with, because like as I was saying to Mike, between Mayra and I, we have 4 computers set up for today, because that's just how we do things now in 2020 and 2021. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. Okay, so Mayra, do you want to start us off with the first slide, the introduction? Yep. Reintroduce yourself if you want.
Adjusting my screen. So once again, my name is Mayra. I am a licensed professional counselor. I've been doing this for about 5 years. And right now my work mainly focuses on working with adults and teens within the Latino community.
Yeah. And I'm currently in a mostly admin role. I do training for clinical staff. I provide multicultural supervision to clinical and admin staff. And I do a lot of our initiatives related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So on that committee. And my history has been working in administration and direct services, overseeing programs and working directly with individuals who belong to marginalized populations. So since 2006, but therapist, I've been a therapist for 6 years. So we're going to talk about decolonizing student and staff relations. So kind of going a little bit further further into from what we had talked about in our keynote. So the workshop is going to address topics related to student mental health. We're going to touch a little bit on how university policies and support may be impacted or affected, or can, if there's room for change, as well as share some basic strategies to adopting a social justice approach to student employer and employee, student employee employer relations.
So why do we use the term decolonize, right? There's other terms that you might hear when we talk about student affairs and student and staff dynamics. But we purposely chose the word decolonize because we really want to look at, when we're thinking of in a university environment, their students, their staff, administration, there's a mix of roles, right? And when somebody sets the standards for what those relationships might look like, we want to explore who's setting those standards and those expectations, as well as what is the student that they have in mind when they were setting those in the first place, right? Because support and supportive relationships might look differently depending on somebody's background. And so it can't be a one-way road in terms of what a professional relationship may look like between staff or between a student and a staff.
Yeah. And when we talk about the considering who you have in mind, even when you're developing policies, when you're looking at wellness policies, when you're looking at psychosocial support, in counseling, we look at who developed this theory and who did they have in mind when they developed this theory. For example, if a theory was based on research that only included white males, that's not going to be it's not going to be an appropriate fit for anybody who's not a white male, and it's based on a different set of norms, values, needs, perceptions, and all of those things. So there are lots of benefits to decolonization, and there's a lot of costs to staying the same. So we briefly touched on that in the keynote. So we know that staying the same and not moving towards decolonization contributes to a continued lack of diversity and racial underrepresentation in staff and in employees. So groups that would benefit from decolonization in a school setting often experience low academic self-esteem and difficulty adjusting to college, contributing to a lower rate of college completion. So we provided stats in the keynote that touched on some of the struggles that college students face. So we want to break those numbers down a bit more as we discuss and consider factors that impact and influence those numbers. So this is from a survey/study that was done of 70,000 students across the nation from, I think, about somewhere around 200 universities and colleges. So pretty representative. And this information really went just through the gamut. And so we're going to touch on the mental health stats first. So we have 27% of college students in the US are diagnosed with depression. So we can assume that this number is low just because there are factors that influence reporting. We talked about reporting anonymously may create different types of responses, and also that people may not really attribute what they're experiencing to depression or anxiety or another mental health issue. So 64% of students actually drop out of college because of mental health reasons. And so we talked about that there was 40% of students who experienced mental health symptoms. And when we look down at when we break those numbers down, it didn't look at history. So when we looked at the last 30 days and the last 12 months, they were pretty low. But when we looked at a history, so 12 months or longer, we saw that 40% of students have a history of suicidal thoughts. They've actually attempted suicide, or they've engaged in self-harm in their lifetime. So 25% of gay or bisexual students report attempted suicide. Another number that we can assume is underreported for various reasons. And finally, 33% of students claim to be dissatisfied with mental health services that are provided on campus.
So when we think of the idea of being dissatisfied with the mental health services provided, this can mean many things. Today, especially, we want to focus on what might be some of those reasons for somebody that holds a marginalized identity, maybe comes from a background that stigmatizes mental health, and was reaching out for services for the very first time.
Right. So everyone has a culture or a set of belief and values that they identify with, right? And due to inequity, bias, and oppression, disparities exist in how certain groups are able to access resources, as well as if they are receiving a high or even standard quality of service. So some of that might be that an individual who belongs to one of these groups is less likely to have access to psychosocial resources and services.
They're also less likely to seek out and receive those services.
They're more likely to receive a poor quality of care. So the biggest example that comes to mind with this is a recent research study that came out last year that showed that Black newborns who were delivered by white doctors were more likely to die in their first 3 months than if they were delivered by a Black doctor. And that was a very large study. What was it, like 2 billion or 3, like a very, very large study. So that indicated some very disturbing facts.
Folks are also more likely to be misdiagnosed or over and under medicated. I talked earlier, I gave an example about working in youth corrections, where one of the things that I constantly heard was that Black and Latino men were angry, right? And so we had a lot of these young kids who were being placed in our residential facility, and they were just seen as these angry gang members rather than really exploring their trauma and what might be contributing to their behaviors and the people that they were being surrounded by.
Yeah, they're more likely to have concerns attributed to personality or cultural stereotypes. So kind of, it's like what Mayra was talking about. Another example is that the medical field, when medical providers were surveyed, 40% actually believed that Black Americans literally have thicker skin, that our skin is thicker than someone who is not Black, which impacts their perception of pain, thinking that, oh, you have a higher tolerance of pain, or that you have thicker skin and you won't necessarily have a negative response in the same way to something else.
Folks are more likely to end services prematurely or drop out. I think as clinicians, Allyson and I can both agree that it takes a few sessions at the beginning to build connection and a relationship with the client. And for some folks, if that doesn't happen within the first few, they end up dropping out of services.
So there's different cultural perceptions about mental illness, help-seeking behavior, and well-being. That could be a whole nother workshop.
There's also access and communication barriers that stand in the way of that person seeking those services.
And there's a general fear and mistrust, and we're even seeing now with the rollout of the COVID vaccine, for example, that we know that COVID-19 disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities. However, Black and Brown communities are not showing up to get the vaccination. And that's because of a general history of Black Americans being treated as experiments.
There's also a lack of family and community awareness when it comes to academic workloads. This is especially true for our first generation students, right? And so when families are unaware of that workload, there's going to be less support.
Yeah. And so similar to Mayra's example from the keynote, we know from research that obstacles that first generation students face include a lack of college readiness, a lack of familial support, like we just mentioned, as well as financial stability or instability. So as we discussed in our keynote, success and survival often depends on developing defense mechanisms to cope with an environment that was designed for members of the dominant culture.
Revisiting the topic of reaction formation that we mentioned in our keynote. So it is a psychological term that speaks to how we respond the opposite way of how we feel. This can be fear of rejection, being in a predominantly white institution and trying to figure out, right, I know for me, it was always like, am I that spicy Latina in the classroom, right? What's my tone like when I'm responding? And a lot of times they can also be a threat to their survival. So I need to navigate this space for the next 4 years. Therefore, I need to put on a different mask and make myself either more tolerable or easy to accept or less assertive. That was one of the big ones for me too, making myself less assertive in front of my white colleagues and classmates. So this picture here is from a scene from The Boys. And so he says, I can't lash out like some raging entitled maniac. That is a white man's luxury. And really speaking to this idea of as a person of color, right? Sometimes we have to think a little bit more about our reactions and really that anger is more a privilege or a luxury that at times we don't feel like we hold.
Yeah, and I think the biggest example that we're seeing now is a response to protests and terrorist attacks. And so we're seeing how the expression of anger, over, Black and brown lives being taken by people who are supposed to protect them is unjustified. However, threatening the vice president's life or breaking into the Capitol is met with a different response and is more understandable. Maybe the response is there's financial frustration, and so that's really fueling a lot of those feelings. And so just seeing the difference in how strong emotions. So again, that beware Black anger or beware brown anger kind of sign. And we know, just like from what Mayra and I talked about, and just in general from the research, that inauthenticity has a cost. Influences burnout, and it influences the development of mental health concerns or exacerbation of existing concerns. I'm sorry. So decolonizing interactions means considering the origin of those norms to which we try to adhere. So this quote is from a Stanford professor, and he says, "Now, who gets to determine what civil behavior and speech is and what is not? Even as administrators espouse the value of community, it is clear that the final arbiters of civility are they themselves. And this is what makes signing on to civility something one should think twice about. Civility is in the eye of the powerful. And if one believes that civility will protect one against homophobic, racist, sexist, and emphatic political speech of all stripes in an even and democratic manner, one should first look at the case history of civility and its relation to free speech." So now let's chat a bit more about the microaggression known as tone policing.
So tone policing, as we see in this comic, it is generally, it hinges on the idea that emotion and reason cannot coexist, so that we can't have reasonable discussions and conversations with one another that involve emotion. So in the comic strip, some of the feelings that might come up when you're being tone policed is, I feel like you're not willing to have a civil discussion with me, or some of the things you might hear. There's no way this can be discussed productively until you calm down. I know that trans folks are more likely to experience violence, but you're kind of letting fear overtake reason at this point, don't you think? So those are some examples that you might hear as people are tone policing and what it means to tone police.
Yeah, and tone policing, again, at its core, is dismissing the valid feeling that's behind that statement. So, and all feelings are valid, whether we agree with them or not. So, considering the feeling as part of a concern is central, is paramount.
So with tone policing, there are 3 different environments that we want to give some examples on that some of you may experience and how those interact with one another, in which tone policing might come up. The first one being in the workplace. This can be something like a conversation between a Black and a white colleague. The Black colleague saying something like, I am really tired of going to these women leadership events and it being only for and about white women. Someone needs to call this out. This is ridiculous. And it really makes our diversity efforts seem one-sided.
And the white colleague might respond with something like, you know, I think you can probably get more buy-in if your approach wasn't as divisive. So you don't want people thinking that you're upset or being difficult or saying that their efforts don't work. Like, you know, I'm all for diversity, but your statement kind of made me feel excluded. Or if as a white woman, I'm doing something wrong. And so in this example, there is the minimizing and the separation of the original person, the person who's presenting the concern, their feelings, and replacing it with the feelings of somebody else, usually from the dominant culture, or in staying with the civility or right to comfort piece.
Another environment in which we may see this is in the classroom. For this, I think for myself, I always remember back to my years in school where, there was always that day in the syllabus of every class that was going to focus on multiculturalism related to that field. And I know for myself personally, I chose whether or not I was going to speak those days or if I was just going to sit in the back and listen. But one of the things that we might see is the professor really sets the tone at the beginning of class that day and makes some sort of rule or statement around, the conversation on that day needs to stay civil and professional without really involving the voices of the students on what that might look like. So the tone policing happens at the beginning before the conversation even starts. And then finally, the last example that we wanted to give is in the community. So tone policing in the community might look something like a Native American or indigenous leader sharing something like, our government has turned its back on our community. Our government and policies are racist and have impacted and even taken the lives of thousands in our community. And we want some action.
And an analyst on a media outlet might say, the reality is more would probably get done if they focused on being civil in communicating their issues. You can't call the government racist and expect a response that is favorable to your efforts. So let's toss that away. So here we want to talk a little bit about living your values.
So I know we're going through things kind of in a very general way, and we can dig into all of these different terms. But as we're going through all of those, tone policing, reaction formation, in an ideal world, if we didn't have to be confronted by a lot of that, ideally we would be able to live our social justice values regardless of the space that we're trying to navigate. And in this case, being able to balance our professional responsibilities and roadblocks in the workplace as we're doing that. In the picture that we see here, it says Black Lives Matter every day. So meaning that as an individual who is either identifies as an activist against police brutality or an ally of the Black Lives Matter movement, or you're being directly impacted by the police brutality going on in the community, you cannot pretend like you live in a colorblind world that very next day at work, right? You cannot shut off your activism self to go sit in class for 50 minutes, to go do your 8-hour shift at work. The activism might just look differently. And another way that that might look like is a licensed psychologist who identifies as somebody who is an activist for LGBTQ rights, right? In their place of practice and in at work, one of the ways in which they can contribute that activism is by focusing their research really on expanding access and relevance of services for the LGBTQ community. So it might just look different, but you still carry this, this label and this passion for being a social justice warrior, like we hear a lot.
Yeah, so you definitely don't have to take off your social justice cape at the workplace. So like Mayra said, your activism may look different, and it's also not we're not talking about big things. We're talking about how do we bring the values that we hold as individuals, and how can we be authentic to those values no matter what environment we're in. And so like Mayra gave one example, and it could just be in educating other people or saying like, hey, did you read this book? Let's read this book together. And you know, there's lots of really small things. It's not always big actions, but it's about finding that balance and living authentically. So we mentioned that we mentioned that there are some things that can get in the way of that. So some things that can make that activism or showing up authentically difficult is when elements of white dominant culture are present. When there is a lack of structured or consistent policies, such as microaggression policies, to address issues in order to support students and employees. And so this is what activism or living social justice values might look like in an organization or within a workplace, is about how is your culture supporting everybody and inclusive of everybody. For example, where we're working, there is not a microaggression policy, and there's a lot of microaggressions that happen. So how are we supporting staff, and how are we communicating, you know, to the community and to ourselves, that this is something that we value. There also may be a need for radical self-healing versus a focus on self-care. So we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. And also there could be a culture of toxic resiliency. So there's, and especially in 2020, I think this is really, really came up a lot. You know, there's this expectation, and this also ties into the reaction formation piece. There's this expectation that no matter what happens, no matter how bad, I'm going to curse, no matter how bad shit gets, you know, it's going to, you're just going to be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, take a nice bath, watch some Netflix, and you're going to come back bigger and better and stronger than ever. And we're going to get through this together, right? So there never is any space for shit to hurt, right? There's never any space for things to not be okay. There's a scramble to get back to okay. And that can be toxic, especially to marginalized populations that really have already been doing that for a long time. Mm-hmm. So we mentioned that inequity, implicit bias, and the like persist because American culture was built on white supremacy. So when I say that, I don't just say or only mean racism. I mean that societal norms were modeled on white European perspectives. So many of those elements continue to exist today. And so intentionally being aware of them and acting in ways that are inclusive of other experiences and needs is fundamental to any diversity, equity, and inclusion or diversity work. So Tenna Occam and Kenneth Jones developed a comprehensive strategy to equity and anti-racism work. So I'm going to go through a couple of those. I can't remember how many there are. There are a lot of elements that he identified. And so I just picked 6 that I felt were relevant to today's discussion and to the environment that you guys are in, as well as some anecdotes about how you can work against those. And so first is equity washing. And so that just means you're signing on to lofty goals or values without putting them into action. So that might look like hiring BIPOC staff without supporting a culture shift to retain them, like having policies like microaggressions or other things, training. And something like maybe putting a DEI or diversity statement in an email signature, but that's really where it ends. It's like, yep, we got it, and now everybody knows. So the anecdote to that is real equity. So that just means focusing on all dimensions within and outside the organization. So next is perfectionism. Again, I don't think, just like with imposter syndrome, I don't think that there's anybody watching who isn't aware of that or may struggle with that. I know that I am a recovering perfectionist, and I have with frequent relapses. But here with when perfectionism is valued, or where perfectionism is the expectation, mistakes are seen as personal, right? And there's very little space for learning. It becomes a failing, a moral failing, a failing of their talent or their ability, versus appreciation. So where mistakes are valued and they're seen as opportunities, and people verbally show their appreciation. So next is defensiveness. So this is where we had mentioned in our keynote, like there's nowhere to air grievances, and there's a focus on protecting power instead of addressing harms, instead of naming intentions, instead of acknowledging impact. So the anecdote to this is vulnerability. Again, shout out to Brene Brown, where we learn to give and receive feedback non-defensively, and again, having a structure to hear and address grievances. So next, and what for me has always come up the most, is fear of open conflict. So that ties in really closely to tone policing. So having a right to comfort. And usually that right to comfort is not with the person who's bringing up the issue or with the group. It's with a dominant group or a group in authority. It could be a person, it could be just part of the culture that we always say nice things. Like I mentioned in my keynote, always putting in smiley faces and not wanting to come off, as too direct. So your politeness is valued over honesty. White fragility goes unchecked, and people who bring up discomfort are scapegoated. And so the anecdote is growth and learning, where people are calling each other in versus calling each other out. So it's identifying things and saying, hey, I noticed this and this is how it felt for me, or this is how I took it. And again, that structure where managers are skilled at providing timely, supportive, and responsive feedback, and they're given training on how to do so and where they can get work on maybe their own issues or biases that come up. So next is either or. So I'm a DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. I'm a DBT trained therapist. So this is another big thing for me. So where you're believing people are either racist or not racist, good or bad, seeing incidents of inequity as isolated events. So really quickly, I know that one time I was teaching a group and a older white lady used a racial slur in my group. Not against me, she just had no idea what that word really meant. And when I, as a DBT therapist, brought it up to her therapist as this is something that you really need to address with your clients, the therapist kept saying, but she's not racist, as if me bringing up this concern meant that she was racist, instead of the fact that there was an issue or an area for growth and learning for her. So the anecdote is systems focused or dialectical thinking, where you're understanding context and intersectionality, and you're seeing patterns, and you're holding contradictory thoughts and feelings at the same time. So you can be sad and you can be confused. You can really like somebody, and you can really hate the way that they're saying something, you know? So there's two opposites that don't appear that they go together, but yet they exist because they're valid, right? So finally, the comfort with predominantly white leadership. So defaulting to all or mostly white leadership, and a lot of the justifications are because, well, there's not enough, you know, we didn't get enough applicants, you know, from that group of people, or they just didn't apply. They're not coming in. We're not, you know, they're not letting us know that they want to work here. You know, there's no qualified people, and that's the way of justifying that. And this is something that is not specific to white people or people who are not BIPOC. This is something that is also internalized. I know for me, my default is that I expect a CEO, a president, or something to be white, maybe a white male, or at least a white female. And when I would see somebody who was not that in a leadership position, I had that moment of bias that I then had to address, because that was my default as well. So the anecdote is that there's, you're having leadership representative of the communities most affected by inequity. So you're having awareness, and you're acting intentionally around acknowledging unconscious socializations that are white, European centered, and that is not supportive of an inclusive culture. So that's a lot of information. We're gonna have all of these references if you're wanting to see some more of Tenna's work around this. So I'm going to finish up talking in a bit because it was a little long time. So being aware of when these elements are present in your environments is critical to decolonizing and promoting healing. So healing our interactions with others is an important first step. So the MECA model, MECA, of supervision gives us a framework with which to consider our interactions with others. So within the MECA model, every social interaction is a cultural encounter. So we don't just shed our cultural skins, our tone of voice, our beliefs, our identities, our skin tone, and become blank slates every time we talk to each other. And as professionals and students, we are aware of how to approach cultural issues generally, right? But only when we're aware of those issues, like, oh, I can see that I'm talking to a Black person, so I'm aware of these cultural issues, and I know not to say this, and I know not to be aware. So that is when we're aware of when to interact in that way. But to take it a step further, we should also be prepared to take a social justice approach to our interactions when issues arise, or if the situation calls for it.
So the cultural diversity approach really is just the, oh, sorry, the most common approach that
You're muted, Mayra.
Oh, am I? Can everybody else hear me?
Mayra, I can hear you. This is
Oh,
Michael.
no.
Oh, okay. So
Allyson, can you hear me? Oh,
I think it's Allyson's sound.
yeah, let me,
That might
I'll
be-
message her. You go ahead,
might be me.
Mayra, and I'll message her.
It was me.
Sorry.
Okay.
All right. So the cultural diversity approach really is the most basic approach to this. It is commonly what we see in clinical and social interactions, and it's at the surface level of inquiring about cultural values and attitudes with curiosity, but also maintaining that the individual is the true expert.
And when we talk about a social justice approach, and I realize that it's my my speaker is dying, even though it's plugged in, so I may have to grab another charger. Technology. So the social justice approach is when we're taking it a step further and we're focusing on the effects of power differentials, as well as on the relationship between two people. So a social justice approach may become evident in issues related to migration, acculturation, ecological context. And this is where we're discussing issues of empowerment, cultural resistance, or social action. And so this model is a model of clinical physical supervision, but that can be generalized to interactions between employer and employees and each other, especially if we're wanting to, again, live authentically and be engaged in moving towards decolonization.
So as we're thinking about all of this information that we've thrown at you today, there's some reflections to consider and keep in mind as you process how you might be able to implement some of the topics we discussed in your supervision or just the overall climate of the office you're a part of. So what power dynamics are in play in the situation? In what ways might tone policing distance me and others from the experiences of those most marginalized? Who is most impacted by this situation, issue, or injustice? What power do I have to amplify the experience and narrative of these groups? Sorry, my throat. And then also, how can I model empathy and validate the feelings of this person or this group? How do I hold myself accountable for continuing to center their experiences versus my own feelings in service of equity, justice, and inclusion? Am I colluding with the power structures in my intent and actions, or am I disrupting in my intent and my actions? What else do I need to know and perhaps research in order to better understand the perspective and truth of this person or this group?
So we can't talk about decolonizing without talking about healing. So there is mass trauma, migration trauma, racial trauma, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, post-traumatic slave disorder, general grief and loss, due to living a certain way of life. So Angela Davis is going to introduce us to the idea of radical self-healing as a way of decolonizing, as an act of defiance, and as a necessary tool for sustainability. So let me know, hopefully you guys can all hear that. No. You guys can't hear that, can you?
No.
Let me stop and do it again.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Also has to learn how to take care of herself, himself, their selves. For a long time, activists did not necessarily think that it mattered to take care of themselves in terms of what they eat, in terms of mental self-care, corporal self-care, spiritual self-care. I know that there were some people who emphasized it. I'm thinking about one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, Erica Huggins, who began to practice yoga and meditation in the 70s. And she encouraged many people, including Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, to join that practice. I think they did a little bit of it, but I think our movement would have been very different had we understood the importance of that kind of self-care. Personally, I started practicing yoga and meditation when I was in jail, but it was more of an individual practice. Later, I had to recognize the importance of emphasizing the collective character of that work on the self. Well, it means that we're able to bring our entire selves into the movement. It means that we incorporate into our work as activists ways of acknowledging and hopefully also moving beyond trauma. It means a holistic approach, I think. I think longevity is important, and not simply individual longevity. It is equally important to recognize that as we develop our movement today, we're creating a terrain for the emergence of new activists. And what we do today has an impact on what younger people will be able to do tomorrow. I think we have to imagine ourselves as connected to people who came before us and to those who will come after us. Black people all over the world have been subjected to the most unimaginable forms of violence, slavery, torture. But at the same time, and this is what Black people have offered the world, we've also produced beauty, music, and art. And I think that the self-care that gets produced by Black people recognizes the connection between struggle and art and beauty and the imagination. It's very dangerous. It's very dangerous not to recognize that as we struggle, we are attempting to presage the world to come. And the world to come should be one in which we acknowledge the collectivity and connections and relations and joy. And if we don't start practicing collective self-care now, there's no way to imagine, much less reach a time of freedom.
Okay. Mayra, can you say something so that I can know if I...
Hello.
See, I did something. I did something and now I can't hear. Say something again.
Can you hear me?
What did I do?
It might be your Zoom settings.
All right, so I am going to...
I will.
There we go. There we go.
Okay, cool.
It happens anytime I use a Bluetooth. I should have known that this was happening. Anytime I use a Bluetooth speaker and then it dies, it messes everything up. So anyway, so Angela talked about radical self-healing, which is self-care decolonized. Again, a whole other workshop, but when we're talking about living authentically and working towards decolonizing, as well as ways that we can support each other, our staff and our students, moving towards and supporting radical self-healing as well as community care is important.
Yes. So healing as a form of liberation. How do we bring our entire selves into the movement, as Angela stated? A radical self-healing can be recognizing and honoring our interconnectedness in order to heal and stay healthy as a community. This can look like grieving, dreaming, cultivating silence. That might look differently for different folks. I know, like for myself, even for this weekend, right? Just needing to be in a different space and allowing myself to sit in silence as I prepared for today. Resting, that doesn't just mean sleep, right? So it might also mean sometimes saying no to activities and different things in order to take some time off, learning, celibacy, playing, just doing something silly, dancing or moving around, taking personal responsibility. This can be out loud or through journaling, whatever that may look like for you. Identifying negative self-talk, especially if you track that maybe there's some imposter syndrome going on. This is a good way to identify what some of those statements are that you make to yourself in those spaces. Creating that can look different. So channel your artistic side, and also moving slow.
Yeah, moving slow is my favorite, because I'll reference the Nat Ministry in a quote in a second. If you're not familiar with them on Instagram and on their blog, definitely check them out, because as Audre Lorde says, you know, the resting and self-preservation in an environment or society that was not meant for you is the greatest act of resistance. That's not the exact quote. So, but community care might look like supporting local business. It might look like honoring your ancestors, being aware of intergenerational trauma, things or issues that have been passed down, or dynamics or patterns that are alive in your family group. Developing a healthy relationship with food. It could have gone on both self-healing or community care. Setting up a communal pot and pitching into it. That might be like, oh, we're all gonna pitch in, you know, $1 so that we can have a monthly cupcake day. If you don't have money, then maybe you're pitching in a recipe, you know, or maybe you're bartering or trading with somebody for a service that you provide. Creating circles, as much as we can create circles, socially distant circles and Zoom circles with other people to do things. Volunteering or donating. And another really important way of living your authentic self, your social justice self, while also sustaining yourself, is making a conscious decision to stand up for something you believe in instead of fighting something that you are against. I might be against somebody calling me a slur, but that's a lot of time. Fighting against something, being in constant adversity or against something leads to burnout, and means that we're less likely to be able to continue this work into the future. So be for something versus being against something. So realizing your worth. You are a sacred addition to a sacred group. And so from the Nat Ministry, when we heal, our community heals. So we hope that you join us and others in healing and moving towards wholeness. There are a ton of resources out there to start this journey or to learn more about it. Again, we would like to thank you so much for giving us this time today, and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Here is where you can reach out to us, Melanated Mental Health CO at Gmail, or Melanated Mental Health CO on Instagram. If you guys got this PDF, here's where all of our references and resources are. So Emily has that if you need it. Mayra, was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I know in the chat there was questions about some of the studies that you referenced, so that is a good resource for those of you that want to learn more, do some more reading about some of the concepts and articles that we use to prepare for today's presentation. In terms of our Instagram, it's a new project that Allyson and I are working on, but we're hoping to build a community and a network for those who are either BIPOC folks seeking mental health services or other clinicians out there.
Yeah. So the study, the study for the college students is going to be something that was done. I forget let me look. The Association for University and College Counseling Center Directors, as well as, so we'll have some of those PDFs. If we have a link to it, then you can definitely check it out. But since you guys might have access already to like journals and things like that, we don't anymore, not being at school. So some of these you may just have to log in to get the full ones if the PDF or the link doesn't allow you to download it.
I know we are almost out of time. I know the second workshop starts at 12:30, so folks need some time to grab a snack, run to the restroom, take a nap, whatever that looks like. But any questions from folks, if you want to either
I see one
put that
question
in the
from
chat.
Christian Dixon. Would you be willing to unmute there, Christian, and give us your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so the comments you made about civility and how it's defined really resonated with me. And I think the question I have for one of you, both of you, either, how can we, well, maybe the question is this: what conditions need to be in place in order for us to move in the direction that you were kind of envisioning, that you shared, right? What conditions need to be in place for us to have a broader conversation, a more equitable conversation, a more equitable definition of civility? That's kind of my question.
Right. Good question. Mayra, did you, I always have comments. Was there anything that you wanted to start with?
I think I was thinking more towards the beginning when we talked about the term decolonizing, right? And just really keeping in mind the students that we're building a space for, and it's going to look different everywhere. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I think for me personally, I think back to my days at CSU, right, where even something as simple as a greeting looked very different walking into El Centro than it did anywhere else, right? I come from a Latino background, so when I'm in Mexico or wherever, right, you greet every single person, and that's what it felt like walking into El Centro. It was the kiss on the cheek, right? That's how we greet in our community. And so being open to ideas like that, when we think of professional environments, I know we have to, be safe, and also with the keep in mind like sexual assault. And so a lot of times there's rules around like side hugs only, right, when you're greeting students. But some students might be more open to, a hug or a kiss on the cheek. And just keeping in mind that to some folks, that's a cultural norm. It's not inappropriate, but at least being open to that conversation if you see something like that going on or happening.
Yeah, and I would add, as far as like structural or organizational policies, is really supporting, really laying a foundation for a culture shift. So creating spaces or changing the spaces that you move in, to allow disagreement. So I know in the cultural consultation, the supervision group that I run, that's one of our base rules is, this is how we disagree. Let's set rules on how we're going to disagree, and let's set rules for when somebody's feelings are hurt, the ouch then educate kind of thing. How are we allowing somebody to express that something didn't sit right with them or something wasn't okay with them. And that doesn't mean that it gets shut down, or that doesn't mean, and we're not threatened by it, but allowing that to continue in the space, and, allowing each person to kind of, debate their points. So it's just about allowing space, creating, those structures, and creating that culture shift so that, we have more equitable spaces where, whether it's brainstorming or team meetings or, supervisor, supervisee, things like that.
Any other questions?
Can I jump in?
Yes.
All right. Thank you guys so much for talking about this. I think it's a conversation that gets passed up too much. So we really need to bring in healing into these spaces, collegiate spaces specifically. I was just curious, you guys were talking about radical self-healing, but how do we bring, so specifically for BIPOC students or marginalized students in general, how do we prioritize like self-preservation or this idea of radical self-healing? And while we're trying to operate in a decolonial praxis in like a colonial space, so like a lot of us are still living in these like collegiate environments or through academia, and so like what does that balance look like? If you guys can talk a little bit, maybe your personal experiences.
Yeah. I don't know if there's really a way to kind of separate those, especially for, BIPOC students. I think, again, it's about having that space to express that's what's happening. And like we talked about in our, in our keynote, it's about how are we also sharing those experiences with others? So how are we empathizing? How are we going down there, going going down there into the deep stuff, into the mucky stuff, and, you know, not being disconnected from our own painful experiences in order to, you know, support each other. And I know that in BIPOC, like for example, I did a emotional emancipation circle over last summer. That is actually Mayra had recommended it to me. That was for Black people. And the model was, you know, here are these elements of white supremacy, here are these African spiritual elements, and how can we reconvene the two? So sometimes it is looking at, you know, history or traditions that we may be disconnected from, and learning different ways to find support versus the support that, you know, we're like, oh, we know we can go to this drawing thing or over here, you know, or, you know, how can we reconnect to, you know, something that's a little bit more traditional and maybe thinking outside the box.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with this idea of like healing isn't linear, right? And it looks different for folks. Everybody needs something a little bit different, right? If I'm really overwhelmed and I might just need to like listen to mariachi and cry for like an hour, right? Like it's gonna look different for everybody. And also thinking of the dynamics within the LSC and CSU as a whole, right? You have administration and you have staff, but you also have student leaders. And I think for folks in those three roles, really the responsibility also comes down to like, how do we model that and normalize healing, right? And normalize vulnerability. As a leader, if I'm showing up to every meeting knowing that I just had a terrible week and I'm just pretending like, you know, just moving on, I might be setting the tone for the folks that are in that meeting with me, right? In terms of like, this isn't a safe space for me to vent or a safe space for me to ask for help. So how are we modeling that ourselves? Even as a clinician, sometimes my clients will ask me how I'm doing, and I'm trying to be more purposeful about not taking over their session, obviously, but being like, you know, it's been a tough week. I think it brings back that humanity, right? Of like the leader in the room of like, okay, so we struggle too. There's not this pressure of like, we need to hold it down for everybody, right? But normalizing that sometimes things can get difficult. And if we need to sit here and just stare at each other for the first 10 minutes today or do some breathing or whatever, right? Or if we need to schedule an office potluck when we're able to do those again, you know, to build some momentum and just bond together, then that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I really like that, the modeling piece, you know, especially for anything, but, you know, if we don't start modeling that and showing others that it's okay, you know, nothing's going to change. You know, we need to, there are those, and that does take on the role, because anybody can be a leader. You don't have to be right in a leadership role to lead in that way, you know, so that's something that we can all do in all of our interactions is, you know, practicing some of that vulnerability, you know, and chipping away, you know, at that toxic resiliency model.
Allyson and Mayra, thank you so very much for what you shared. Before we wrap up, I just want to make sure everybody saw the link that I posted in the chat. If you need to go ahead and confirm for your supervisor that you were in attendance, please do fill that out. And I want to be respectful of our presenters' time, knowing that they've been on for a while here. So wanted to thank you very much for what you've done and what you've done here for us today and for joining us. Yeah, anything you want to say in parting words?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We appreciate this and we appreciate being able to share our passion with you guys.
Yes, thank you, everybody. It's nice seeing familiar faces and names. So it's good to be back.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all.
Have a great rest of your day.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks again.
Thank you.